here so that I can see the slides. Is that okay for everyone? Can everyone hear me? Everyone can hear me down the back and that. Great. Okay. So what I'm talking about today is part of an overall piece of work looking at reality television parenting programs. And the theme that I have been working on quite intensively within that is the way in which kin networks outside of the nuclear family are represented by these programs. So that's going to be the theme for today, how grandmothers, etc., are seen in reality television parenting programs and how then audiences interpret these portrayals. So just to set the background very, very quickly, the real kind of brief overview. Can people see this? Is it too bright, or do we need lights off or anything? Reality television parenting programs focus on the nuclear family. Kin, particularly grandmothers, have a capacity to disrupt this portrayal because they are family, but they are not nuclear family. Whereby the term I'm using, nuclear family, I very much mean that if you think back to the 1950s ideal of mammy, daddy, 2.4 children and the dog, image of the nuclear family, which even in its heyday, even in Ireland, which was one of the countries which most adopted this pattern, even in the 1950s when it was at its heyday, still did not make up fully 50% of all household types. So it was never as dominant as it was portrayed to be, but it is still a very strong cultural ideal. And kin, such as grandparents, can disrupt this image of our concept of a family as purely mammy, daddy, 2.4 children and the dog. So they threaten messages about what is normal family life. In response, part of what I'm saying is that the programme makers can't avoid showing the occasional grandmother on screen or uncle or aunt on screen, but they frame these images in very passive terms within the programmes, neutralising and minimising their role. So just to look at some of the, to kind of introduce some of the concepts, I'm presuming everybody in the room is already kind of aware when I say reality television parenting programs, what I'm talking about. But just to put some small amount of background, in 2004 we had the launch of Supernanny on Channel 4. And this was very much the start of the genre. Now here we have Jo Frost Supernanny, wagging her finger. There was a brilliant picture up on her website where she was actually wagging her finger straight into the face of a little boy. It was such a strong image. When I went back to steal the picture from her website, they'd replaced it by this one. There's all kinds of other ones, many of which focus very much on the corporeality of the child, on the physical embodiment of the child rather than anything else. So we've got Honey, We're Killing the Kids, we've got Chubby Children, we've got these kind of programs. The whole physicality and corporeality of the child, what the child eats when the child goes to bed, how their bodies are managed is a very strong theme within the programs, to the point that some focus on that quite exclusively. But the picture I want to kind of pull out and draw attention to, because people will not be quite as familiar with it, this picture here is David Coleman. He is, we're told by the program makers, a psychologist, a qualified psychologist and practitioner who runs Irish programs. He's done a couple of different series of programs in Ireland. One is called Bringing Up Baby and one is called Families in Trouble. Now I'm focusing quite strongly on the program Families in Trouble today and within my own research. And I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. I had started off with a strong focus on Supernanny as the most popular program, the one that audiences were most likely to have seen. What I found once I started doing audience interpretation focus groups was that simply because it was English and I was doing my research in Ireland, this was creating a little bit of distance. Audiences weren't giving me a lot of depth of answers. They were saying, oh, well, that's English. English children are terribly badly behaved. English children are this, that and the other. By showing clips of Families in Trouble, that bypassed that, and I was getting much better data. The interviewees were initially saying, oh, I'd never watched that. But as soon as I showed the clips, they were discussing the rest of the episode that I hadn't shown, indicating that in actual fact they do watch the RTE versions as well. So that's kind of the background in terms of what is reality television. What do I mean when I talk about the nuclear family and kin? First of all, kinship as an idea comes very strongly. It's a lot easier when doing searches for concepts of kinship within scholarly literature. You find a lot more within anthropology than within sociology. In sociology, it's an idea that's often quite ignored. When it's addressed at all, it's often addressed as a concept which almost relates to adults only. Kinship networks are these nice, cosy networks which help keep society structured because they manage interactions between adults. And I found this on a friend's LiveJournal page when I was putting together information. And I thought that it was a lovely quote which just reinforces this hegemonic concept of what kinship is. So the person is saying, my brother's fiance's father has died and the funeral is tomorrow in London. As one of the only members of the family in the country, I feel obliged to go. I'll be catching the early train with standing room only, and then hopefully getting back. And he continues to moan and moan and moan about how difficult this is going to make his day because he's got something very important on that evening and so on. But there's lots of concepts within this which go for the real typical traditional concept of kinship. The brother's fiance's father, it's quite removed, but it still exists as a connection. Because it exists as a connection, it brings with it obligations. He must go to the funeral. So kinship is a concept which creates distant but still important connections between adults. Kinship system is the system that organises that somebody will be there at the funeral when someone dies, even though they've never met the man in question, and so forth. So that's what kinship is often seen as within sociology, and it doesn't overlap much with research on the nuclear family. The nuclear family, on the other hand, is studied. It can be studied within two main schools of sociology. You've got the sociology of the family, where the nuclear family is seen as a central unit of analysis for society. Everything that goes wrong in society, drugs, drink, unemployment, you name it, if it's a social issue, it can be seen as coming back to the nuclear family, where the household with parents resident with their biological children is the unit of analysis. And within this kind of analysis of the family within sociology, you often get a strong overlap between what is and what ought to be. So children are raised by their biological parents. Children ought to be raised by their biological parents. And if something deviates from that norm, it shouldn't, rather than it doesn't, is the way it's often presented. In response to that, coming from the other political perspective, you have sociology of families. And when sociologists say that they're studying families, they often use this term very much to mean that they're getting away from this right-wing idealism, the whole confusion between is and ought to be. And this whole school of sociology of families challenges quite heavily the hegemonic norms that exist within sociology of the family, and questions whether the heterosexual married couple with dependent, biologically related children is the only family form. But even within this, it can still be argued that these sociologists are still reinforcing rather than challenging the ideal of the nuclear household as the key unit of society, because they are still focusing intensely on this. Now, Ulrich Beck, for example, has said, I just find my place in my notes, he discusses how the continuity of the nuclear family rests heavily, in his opinion, on the continuity of social sciences, preoccupation and obsession with the nuclear family. Research is carried out constantly into the nuclear family, and the nuclear family is the key unit of analysis for sociological interpretation of multiple issues. Michelle Barrett and Mary McIntosh also discuss how the family, with capital letters, can be used and abused as a unit of analysis for every issue from health and illness to crime and education. In this way, these arguments become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The family is important, so it is studied, so the importance of the family is revealed. Feminist and critical sociological attempts to redefine families have not managed to break the stranglehold or create a new way of looking at and studying interpersonal connections or mechanisms for organising childcare and socialisation. Childcare, just to kind of jump on again now from that, another background area to the study is the whole idea of childcare advice, because one of the functions of these reality television parenting programmes is to give childcare advice. Now again, I mean, everybody here is quite familiar with this field of study anyway. It predates the printed word. There was always some form of childcare advice being given in some form of pamphlet or just as accepted forms of advice and stories that people passed from one to another. And it has always tended to use any media available in any given society. Nowadays, it's often thought as being books or classes. So you have the whole Wonder Years phenomenon, you have the Triple P programme, etc. Parents are encouraged when they drop their kids to school, the posters are there on the wall encouraging them to do a parenting class. Reality television came into this field in 2004, so it's quite a recent and modern phenomenon, with Supernanny starting off the whole thing at that point. Childcare advice is not politically neutral, as again, I mean, we've been kind of talking about already. I'm telling people things that they very much know. From the very beginning, philosophical and religious tracts have always promoted the methods of raising children as part of the good life or the holy life or the religious life. Moving on from there, you had the whole scientific notion of what science can give us rather than what mothers need, coming out quite strongly. And a major concern within a lot of, a major motivation and argument for why we give childcare advice going back 100 years. Dr. Cadogan published a pamphlet in which he said, you know, when women raise babies, babies die. So these mothers operating on their natural instincts had no clue how to do it. The good doctor had to come in and tell the mother how to do it, and then the baby would survive, whereas if she was left to her own devices, the baby would die. Eugenics became a very important part of the motivation for childcare advice in the first half of the 20th century, whereby the lack of fit soldiers to be recruited into the army, etc., became a major problem. We wanted a white nation, we wanted a healthy nation, we wanted a nation that could create strong soldiers. So it was the mother's duty to think of England or Ireland, as the case may be, and raise strong, healthy children. By about the 1950s, this strong eugenics message within childcare advice was beginning to be found less and less often. And the question is, what has it been replaced by as a significant motivation? One of the things that has emerged quite strongly is this whole idea of we give childcare advice nowadays not to create a strong white nation, because people maybe are perhaps even just uncomfortable saying that. But they say something else. They say it's because the extended family is dead. The nuclear family is under grave threat and the extended family is dead, and we have this huge crisis in the family in modern Western society, particularly in the English-speaking world. So one of the things that I found when starting to do the research was that I was having quick meetings with gatekeepers to see if I could go in and have focus groups with women meeting in community centres and so on. And I found that the meetings with the gatekeepers were yielding just as much data. So this is with a community health worker who ran groups, and she's talking about the grandmothers. Very specifically, she's not talking about the mothers she works with. This is not how she views the mothers she works with. This is how she views the grandmothers. She says, because there's always issues there. Drink, drugs, depression. So the grandmothers cannot support the mothers because they're all running around getting drunk, snorting cocaine, whatever it is that grandmothers do nowadays, completely untrustworthy and unreliable, and not fit to give advice to their daughters or support their daughters. So the community health worker needs to step into the place where the grandmothers used to be and give childcare advice to the young women parenting instead. So it's quite an interesting image of grandmothers, because it's certainly not the image of grandmothers that I would have grown up with, running around getting drunk, snorting coke, whatever the case may be. Now, this whole idea of society breaking down and grandmothers being incompetent because there's problems with them runs through quite a lot of other areas. So this is a quote from a psychologist who was writing back in the 1970s when this theme started to become very, very dominant. And he says, historically, parents learned about child-rearing methods and strategies from their own parents. And he jumps on to, presently, parents are more likely than ever to turn to professionals or experts. So he's harking back to a golden era in the past, before the 1970s, where the extended family worked and people didn't need to be taught childcare. But that all fell apart in the 1970s, according to a psychologist. Now, the Irish state produced the Best Health for Children report. So this is like an Irish version of the Every Child Matters kind of reports and so on, leading out very clearly what the Irish state is going to do for children. And of course, going back to the whole corporeality of it, it's called Best Health for Children, not just Best Outcomes for Children or anything, but Best Health for Children. And on page 11 of this report, at the very beginning, in the introduction, it justifies why we need a Best Health for Children report by saying, in the past, most modern Western societies could claim normal parenting pattern. Many Western societies now report that their previous family norms have undergone dramatic change. So we have the exact same theme emerging here. So we've psychologists saying it, we've the state saying it and putting their absolute stamp of approval on it. And a health promotion journal, again, from the 1970s onwards, are saying the same things. And I find this a particularly hilarious quote. I love using it because it really kind of dates it, because he's saying, at least west of the Iron Curtain. But again, he's saying, in traditional societies, parentcraft is another of the things to be imparted in the family context, etc., etc. But we had this huge breakdown of the family in the 1970s. Grandmothers are running around using drink and drugs. Nowadays, can't be trusted, don't teach their kids how to raise parents. We've this big crisis on our hands. And we have this theme coming through state policy, psychologists, health promotion workers, anecdotally from the ground, people teaching parenting classes, all saying the same thing. In the past, in traditional societies, historically, the extended family worked. Now it's broken down. Now we need to replace it with parenting classes. It is amusing to look at it because, of course, this discourse is very much a discourse which has run from the 1970s to today. And it's not weaning off. It's getting stronger and stronger. For all these quotes from the 70s are funny, I don't think they were as strong as the quotes from the community health workers openly accusing grandmothers of using drink and drugs the whole time. So it's getting stronger, not weaker. But we know from the likes of, say, Christina Hardeman's books, that there's no basis to say that childcare advice was something that only came about in the 1970s. It didn't. The ideology that this is the motivation why became very strong from that time onwards. So what about this poor mother-in-law? It's always the mother-in-law, you'll notice, but it's quite an interesting way of doing it. Because for wherever you have two parents of a child, either one's mother is the other's mother-in-law. So the mother-in-law is every granny, it's important to remember. So these were the ones who had little enough time for their own families or who successfully mismanaged their own children and are now straining on the sidelines waiting to have a go at the next generation. Hang on now, because I have that reference more properly. It was from, if I just find it quickly in my notes here, this is what I always do. Here we go. Hugh Jolly. No, sorry, that one wasn't from Hugh Jolly. Hugh Jolly said, it's now taken for granted that the new mother will have the advice of experts and will not have to rely on her own mother. The previous generation of mothers may not necessarily be the best advisors to the present generation. This is the kind of advice that was being given. Anne Cuthbert was writing from the 1950s onwards constantly about the mother-in-law who interferes excessively, presuming she knows it all, and not accepting that the new mother can learn better methods from her baby care books and health visitors. So within printed text, even going back before this ideology became very strong, from the 1950s, printed childcare books, women's magazines, etc., were constantly warning the new mother not to listen to her own mother, or more importantly, the mother-in-law, because they didn't know these new scientific ways of raising children. They'd give bad advice. Don't listen to them. So this is the great irony within this discourse, that on the one hand, the discourse of giving parenting advice builds itself up on an ideology that the extended family, the kinship networks, have completely broken down and died, and therefore parenting advice is needed to replace them. But on the other hand, they also openly attack that very thing which they're saying doesn't exist, creating a contradiction, because if it doesn't exist, it doesn't need to be attacked. But it is constantly being attacked within this literature. Don't listen to the mother-in-law, she'll give you bad advice. We only give parenting classes because the mother-in-law isn't there to give advice. There's a contradiction within it, obviously. This is just one, again, kind of setting the background. What does reality mean? When we're talking about reality TV programs, I am presenting them very much as constructed texts, which are heavily edited. And I don't kind of need to go into this in any great depth. The cameras come in and follow people in a relatively unscripted and spontaneous way. And there is major debate within this about the use of children. A lot of criticism comes about the use of children because the children are not acting as such. But on the other hand, there's so much editing goes into it, and you can see this if you sit down and watch the programmes frame by frame. You can see even like when the daffodils are out in one, and it's supposed to be the end scene, but then you'll see another programme, another clip at another time the daffodils are buds in the same garden, and at another time they're wilted, and they're completely out of sequence. So you can tell someone had sat in the cutting room and created this narrative which was actually filmed in the exact opposite sequence. The children were behaving worst when the daffodils were faded and behaving best when they were still buds. But they're being presented the other way around. So they are edited texts, and I have been treating them entirely as edited text for that reading. The other thing that's worth saying about the whole concept of reality television is that audience interpretation studies have found that, in general, audiences tend to give far more hegemonic readings of reality television. When audiences watch fiction on the television, they are aware that they are watching fiction, they are aware that they're suspending disbelief. And when you interview them afterwards about what they thought of the programme, they are very astute, they are very capable of dissecting and understanding, well, that television programme gave that message, but my opinion is X, Y, Z. Even in terms of the old-fashioned kind of documentary programmes, again, people are savvy, people have the skills to deconstruct this. Particularly when reality television first came out and audience studies were first done, what was found was that because it was a whole new genre, there was a lot more audience confusion. Audiences tended to think, well, this is reality, this is a fly on the wall, this is reality, there's no need to deconstruct this text. I will absorb it as a package and accept all the messages within it. Now, this is what early audience studies of reality television tell us. I'm not sure that my own research backs this up, as we'll get into some of the findings as we go on. And there's a lot to be borne in mind here. First of all, reality television is a very new genre. Although you've candid camera programmes and so on going back to the 1950s, as a main genre, it really only came about within the last 10 years. So if early studies were found that audiences did not have those initial media skills to be able to deconstruct the texts, that doesn't mean that 5 years later they still don't. And some of my own research is showing that the mothers who watch Supernanny and Families in Trouble are showing a fair amount of slowly developing skills in terms of being able to be media savvy and deconstruct the texts. But it's worth remembering that previous research has indicated that reality TV as a medium is one which is often accepted far less critically by audiences than other forms of television. So that's kind of laying the groundwork in terms of the key themes that I'll be looking at. What do we actually learn from the programmes themselves? one of the first things we find out, actually breaking down what are these programs and what are they saying, there's a lot of criticism about this reality television parenting programs because they show deviant families. They show the families in crisis. They show the families completely breaking down. And this is a kind of an idea I had myself at the very start. But when I sat down and actually broke down, right, who's shown on screen, what we find is a pattern of very normal families. So Supernanny, now I haven't included in this Supernanny USA. I chose not to include that as being a little bit step beyond what I was doing. If the Ireland-England was a problem, I think moving to the USA was going to create a bit of a problem for me in terms of audience interpretation. But we found that until Supernanny USA, Supernanny had featured 23 families. 21 of those families were the absolutely accepted form of mammy and daddy and resident children. And this follows through the rest. If you break down, actually find your lists of who is on these programs, they are fitting very closely into the hegemonic norm, as opposed to these. It's easy to think of them as these deviant families because you see a child having a temper tantrum on screen and it looks big because it's emotive, but in actual fact, when you break down into the reality of who's being shown on screen, they're quite normal families. The Irish version differs, and this is one of the things that fascinates me. Why is the Irish programme going a slightly different direction? It's kind of almost consciously setting out to be a little bit more pluralistic in the type of families it features. So you had 2 series of Families in Trouble that were produced. Each one was 4 episodes long. One was a clip show going back to, not necessarily a clip show, but going back to previous families to see how they'd gone on since. So you had 7 families in total being featured between the 8 programmes. Of these 7 families, you had 3 couples, 3 single parents who were all mothers without a father present at all, no mention of the father. In one case, he was very, you were shown his gravestone. He was very much dead. In the other 2, there was, there was no mention at all. And you had one family where a co-parenting couple were living separately, but were co-parenting, spending equal time with the children, and both parents were involved equally in the programme. So you have this very slight, almost conscious attempt to be a little bit more pluralistic. We'll include the co-parenting families, we'll include the single families, etc. What effect that has is another question altogether. But it's certainly not the Supernanny pattern. But in conclusion, we really can say these aren't actually the deviant families. This is the hegemonic family norm of the key nuclear family in particular. Additional kin featured. Additional kin are not featured very often. Within the Irish, the 7 families that I said that I have really broken down and concentrated on within Families in Trouble, you have 3 kin members who come up a lot within their particular episodes and also come back within the clips episode and how has this family got on. These are 2 grandmothers, one is called Evelyn, one is called Peggy, and you have an Uncle Thomas. These 3 members of kin take up a reasonable amount of time. So I'm going to be looking at the portrayal of these 3 individuals within this programme series. What do we learn from looking in particular at these people? We learn that kin can be portrayed in a number of ways. Kin can be portrayed as simply unimportant. Kin can be portrayed as passive, lacking agency in their own right, and kin can be portrayed as victims. Within this as well, they're being framed the whole time as a problem. So supporting roles, the use of kin are as supporting roles to allow narrators to speak over background visuals. This is a common over and over again. If you do an analysis breakdown, the amount of time a person spends on screen versus how often you hear their voice, you find that the ratio changes for kin members versus nuclear family members within these families. So kin will be seen but not heard, quite literally. One particularly very good example of this comes from an episode, it runs through the particular programmes that I've been talking about, but one particular episode that I broke down in detail to study was from the programme Honey, We're Killing the Kids. So you had a 1 minute long clip of a woman called Susan being sent for a car driving lesson. Part of this clip was the grandfather in the family arriving to babysit the child while Mammy Susan went for a car driving lesson. And you see him come in the back door of the house, hug the child hugs him, he hugs his daughter, he wishes her good luck. She goes out to take her car driving lesson. The entire clip takes exactly a minute from beginning to end. 14 seconds of that minute feature the grandfather. His voice is heard in the background only, and you have to turn the volume way up to hear him. He's got 5 words. He's got, "Don't be soft," which he says to the child when the child starts screaming because the mother leaves, and "good luck" to her. So he's got 5 words, but you only hear them if you turn the volume way up, because the narrator is speaking the whole time. This whole clip of him coming in the back door and hugging both people in the family is used purely as background visuals to allow the narrator time to speak. It's nothing else. But within this clip, we still see that he comes in the back door without knocking, that he has a sense of belonging within this family. Now, there's always cultural differences, but to me, somebody that comes in a back door without knocking is a member of that family. Somebody who's not a member of that family would not do that. So there's a strong indicator within this 14 seconds of the programme that the grandfather is very much a member of the family and has a role to play, a strong role to play in the socialising and care for this particular child. But we are only introduced to that at all because the narrator needed a moment to speak about the importance of car driving lessons. In comparison, after those 14 seconds, the rest of the minute are given over almost entirely to the driving instructor speaking to the woman who's learning her car driving in a very patronising way and in a very, you know yourself, you've seen these programmes, you know the way they can be used. He's laughing at her poor driving skills. It's her first driving lesson ever. She's really nervous. She's getting it all wrong. He's being really patronising towards her, and it fits within the whole thing perfectly. So the driving instructor, who's a stranger, is given a strong voice. The grandfather, who's not a stranger, who's a member of the family, is used purely as a background support to the narrator. And this is a strong theme running through all these programmes, that this is exactly the way the kin are used to allow the narrator to speak. They're used as replaceable babysitters. After this, kin are often posed as a problem. And again, we can see this from an episode of The House of Tiny Tearaways, which is a particularly interesting one to see this come up in, because The House of Tiny Tearaways has a slightly different way, a slightly different mechanism. They take the nuclear family out of their own home and place them in, quite literally, the house. So of course grannies aren't going to appear on screen, of course granddads aren't going to appear on screen, etc. But you have a particular scene within this even, where the parents are telling the psychologist that they have a problem because they try and implement rules, but then when Granny is minding baby when mummy's at work, Granny doesn't implement the rules the same way. And she's horrified. And she says, "This is a problem." They are her exact words. She says, "This is a problem." She says something else I can't remember. And then she goes, "In all my years of clinical experience, I have never come across this problem before." So,
this is Tanya Byron.
Yeah, Tanya Byron. So Tanya Byron presents a grandmother, just the existence of a grandmother minding a child, as a problem which in all her years of clinical experience she's never come across. It must be very, very deviant altogether, if this is what she's saying about it. Now, coming back to the programme which has been the main focus of my research, the Families in Trouble, the Irish version, and the grannies, Evelyn and Peggy, which we see within this. Excuse me, I had done all these complicated tables, and I decided it was not worth fussing with complicated tables, so I didn't bring them. So where that says handout 4, I didn't use them, sorry. So Evelyn and Peggy are presented in very problematical lights, and what we're going to do is go on and have a look at how this happens. So kin are seen as passive, but they're also seen as obstructing and incompetent. In this, I'm going to look at, first of all, we have the uncle who's presented within one of these programmes, who's presented in a very, very negative light. He's shown making verbal threats towards the children. the verbal threat he makes to them is that if they don't behave themselves, they're going to be sent to go and live in the Bold House. And he's seen making this verbal threat on about 5 occasions sequentially. And the psychologist, David Coleman, goes doolally. You can't threaten children. That's a terrible thing to do. It has to stop. But the focus is not purely...
Tell people what the Bold House is. I don't think people know.
The Bold House is an orphanage, which would have been very common in Ireland up until the 1970s. I think the last one closed in the early 1990s. So it would have actually been a real feature. Within, I'm conscious of going off on a slight tangent, but I mean within the audience discussions of this, what was coming up was not, they were stopping talking about Thomas because they were starting to talk about real experiences of a Bold House. One of the interview participants, her sisters were sent to the Bold House because her mother got TB. So it was a real grounded experience for the audience to talk about this because it was a real thing. On the other hand, it no longer exists, but it was a common threat. It was a threat that every Irish mother or every Irish uncle or every Irish grandfather would have made to their children for many years. But none of that historic or cultural background was acknowledged by the psychologist who simply took the incident by itself and said, we've got to look at this incident divorced from the culture in which it's happening, or the fact that it was a real event that probably happened in his life, and we've got to simply see it as this threat being made to these children. It's wrong, it's bold, you mustn't do it. Bold in Irish vocabulary also means bad, not brave. That's another thing I probably should have thought to say. I forget that other people don't say bold always means bad. It never means brave. I know in England it can be used to mean brave, but in Ireland the word would never mean brave. It's always bold, naughty, bad. So the bad house would be another way of saying it. But because he's making these threats, he is eliminated, essentially, is what happens. So the psychologist never meets with this person who's the children's uncle. He only deals with the mother. He only speaks to the mother. And he tells the mother that she has to stop her brother from making these threats to the children. So the mother, the psychologist engineers it, but he takes no part in it, and the mother sits down with the brother and tells him he has to stop. And she gets him to talk to the children, to tell the children that the Bold House has been closed down now. They can't be sent to the Bold House because all the children are good now. And from that moment on, he's never featured in the programme. So you could say he's symbolically annihilated by the psychologist as a bad influence on the children, and instead of attempting to alter his behaviour, he's simply removed. Now again, if you go through the programme frame by frame, you see that he's not gone completely, because you can see him through the window. He seems to have, if you break down those frame by frame, what's happening out the kitchen window while the narrator is talking and all kinds of interesting things are going on between the mother and the children at the window. He seems to have some kind of carpentry business from the premises, from the back garden. He seems to live in the house. He seems to be resident there. We can't say that for 100% certainty, but he seems to be resident in the same house with the mother and the children, and he seems to have a carpentry business in the back garden. So he is present with the children all day long, but the camera decides from that moment the Bold House is closed down. He'll never be featured again. And most tellingly, at the very last scene with the psychologist, where he's talking about the future for the family and how well the mother's done and she's made so much progress and so on, he then says she is a lone parent, she is on her own. She has no support from anybody. And this is a very telling phrase. If she's resident with her brother, who's taking a very active father-type role with her children, but because he's her brother, he's symbolically annihilated, and the psychologist is comfortable saying that this mother's parenting completely alone with no support from anybody. In comparison with other families where there's a father there present, some of the other families he's looked at, but always away on business, always gone from the house at 5 in the morning and back at midnight. And this is not being said about those families, that this mother's completely on her own with no support from anybody. It is being said about the mother whose brother is present all day, every day, you know, which is what is interesting about it. Moving on from talking about Thomas, the mothers, the grandmothers, the case of the Carlins, Evelyn is the grandmother here. And again here you have a lone mother with no evidence of father being involved in any way, but she's resident in the same house as her own mother. So the mother, the grandmother, and the children all live together in the same house. There's 2 little twin boys of about 2. And they're all resident together in the one house. And the dynamic between the mother and daughter is featured quite strongly in this programme, and the dynamic between the grandmother and the twin boys is featured quite strongly. But the solution of the programme is to take responsibility away from the grandmother, and this is quite simply the solution. We're told at the very end that the mother has completed her beauty qualification that she was doing. She was a student throughout most of the filming, and Granny was minding the children while she went to college. But by the end of filming, she has qualified and has got a job, and because she's got a job, she can now afford to pay for childminders who come into the house even though Granny's there, and life is better for the Carlins now. This is the phrase we're told over and over again, because the childminder has now been employed, so Granny no longer has any formal or official role with the grandchildren. Again, no mention of the fact that they're obviously still co-resident in the same house. That's just not mentioned. Her formal role, any responsibility she had is taken away, a babysitter's replaced it, and life is better for the Carlins now. Granny Peggy is a slightly different situation, because this is a couple, so her treatment within the programme is very, very different, as I'll get on to in a minute. But she has to make some changes because she gives the children lunch when they finish school. She's got about an hour's childcare every day. It's not long, because the mother comes home about an hour after the children come home from school, but Granny Peggy gives the children lunch and has to change what she does when she gives the children lunch. And we're told repeatedly, not just once, that making these changes was the hardest thing she ever did in her whole life. Not cutting the crusts off sandwiches anymore. The hardest thing she ever did in her whole life. Because she's old. We're told this over and over again. She's too old to make changes. God love her. Poor thing. Can't be asking her to stop cutting crusts off. She did it for her own kids. She did it all her life. Poor thing. So this is, again, because they're framed in very passive terms, they're also framed as having no agency of their own. And this makes them a threat. They are obstructing and incompetent. They're not reliable childminders. They can't be trusted. They're too old to know how to make changes. And that's if they're grandmothers. If they're a young working class male, well, we're into a world of pain there. That's altogether different. The other way in which they're framed as passive as well is, as I was just kind of touching on, as victims. So the young mother who has a child while still in college has some problems in her life, but at some point you could say she chose to be a mother, or she chose whatever actions that led to her becoming a mother. Poor Granny did not choose to become a granny at that age. And this is what we're told over and over again, subtly within the programmes, that kin roles are not so actively chosen as parenting roles are. Now, of course this is problematic, but it's the implication that comes through from the programmes. So kin are unfortunate to have these extra burdens lumbered on them. So they're passive victims of the situation. Again, reducing their agency and their competence within that. Kin and fatherhood is what I find really interesting within this. Now, in part, there's a completely separate part of the research which is looking just at the gender dynamics. But the gender dynamics within across all the parenting programmes that I've studied, the Irish Families in Trouble, the English Supernanny, all the other English ones, there's a remarkable consistency across all of them. I probably should have, I think I have another quote here. Jane Sunderland in 2007 wrote a wonderful little article breaking down the text of parenting advice literature and looking at the gender roles within that. And she has a lovely, just the title of her paper is Baby Entertainer, Bumbling Assistant and Line Manager. And this is a lovely title because it completely sums up the way current childcare literature, current parenting literature presents the different gender roles. She did a deep linguistic analysis of the different ways in which the word mother is used, the word father is used, when are they used in passive and active terms, etc. And what she finds within this is that despite an attempt to use very carefully gender-neutral language, what happens is mothers tend to get mentioned about 10 times as often as fathers, where they get mentioned specifically. And mothers get mentioned specifically within very much process, action, tasks. Mothers change babies' nappies. Mothers give babies bottles. Mothers breastfeed. Mothers do jobs. Mothers do all the work. Fathers have a very divided role, because on the one hand they take the decisions. Right? So fathers are very much part of deciding whether baby's breastfed or bottle fed, and are very much discussed within this important decision-making role, even though they're not discussed about in terms of the actual mechanics of bottle feeding or breastfeeding. I do acknowledge it's a little bit hard for fathers to breastfeed, but how and ever. On the other hand, they're discussed as bumbling assistants who need supervision. So childcare literature tells mothers, even though he may be bad at it, you should encourage father to occasionally change baby's nappy. Yes, you'll have to supervise, and yes, you'll have to check it's done properly afterwards, but it's good for their bonding, so you should still encourage it to happen. So fathers make decisions, and fathers are bumbling assistants who play with baby, but their work needs supervised. Within the programs, we find the exact same thing. I mean, it's spooky almost how exact same. Even when I did a minimal kind of linguistic analysis myself on some of the programs, I was finding the exact same things that Jane Sunderland had found in printed text, which was very, very interesting. So the father role within childcare literature is this role that they have a strong decision-making capacity, but in terms of actually doing the work, they're a bit bumbling, they need some supervision from mum. So mum's job is the work, dad's job is the decisions. And within the programs, this comes through very, very strongly. So again, we have scenes constantly shown over and over again on all these programs. We're going to set the family rules, and you'll see mother and father with the psychologist or super nanny or whoever it is in the particular one that you're watching. And they will take the decision, and the camera will focus a lot on father's face. Father and mother will get to speak about equally, but if you do an analysis of the length of time they get to speak for, there's different ways of kind of counting it. You can count simply the amount of time somebody speaks, but if you break down, which is really tedious and a lot harder, the actual number of seconds they get to speak for. Fathers and mothers get to speak about as often at these decision-making scenes in these programs, but fathers get to speak for a lot longer. They get more to say in terms of what we think the new rules for our family should be. When a father isn't present, you get what you could refer to as the father void. If you think of any of these, any of these programs, there's often very set formal scenes that you know are going to happen because they're very repetitious. Every episode is the same as the last. So take Honey, We're Killing the Kids, for example. You've got this white room and you've got two obvious spaces, one for the mother and one for the father. When there's no father, you get what you could term the father void. And this father void is one in which grannies can be slotted into as necessary.
Are we getting towards the...
Yeah, great. How do audiences interpret all these messages? That's the other question. Now, one of the things within media studies of audience interpretation, you can often break, I know I'm kind of grossly simplifying in one sense, but you can find audiences making hegemonic readings of a text, whereby they simply accept everything that the text says. You can find audiences making counter-hegemonic readings of a text, whereby they deconstruct all the messages within it and choose to reject anything that doesn't hold with their own value system. And you can find audiences most likely making mediated, whereby they'll be savvy enough to see some of the messages, they'll interpret some of the messages, they'll accept others in a less savvy way. What audiences are saying about these programs? They're saying the role of kin positions are different. These programs are trying to slot kin. They're trying to either eliminate kin or slot them into parenting positions, but the role of kinship positions are not the same as that of parents, and this is a good thing, right? So they're talking about grannies mostly. They don't talk about uncles, aunts, grandfathers, etc. nearly as much. Audiences talk almost exclusively about grannies. And what they say about grannies is, there's been a very consistent message come through the focus group so far, is that it's granny's job to give unconditional affection without discipline. This is granny's job. And they see this as important, and they see it as very different from the job of a mother or father. And they see that as a good thing. It is the mother's job to say, no, you can't have a biscuit without dinner. But it is the granny's job to sneak the child a biscuit behind mummy's back. And both are a good thing because both are needed for a child. And the audiences are quite savvy about kind of breaking this down and saying this quite eloquently. Within the programmes, they noticed that the job of granny as presented by the programmes was not the same as their idea. The grannies aren't presented in these programmes as having this job of slipping the bicky behind mammy's back. They were not critical of this. This was the irony. They were totally uncritical of any particular presentation of any particular granny, but they were very critical of the overall theme. They were very critical in particular of the lack of a discussion when granny's job is hard. Now I'll just kind of really quickly move on. Here's a quote that kind of shows this very, very clearly. One of many which kind of pulled on this theme. So she's saying, it's hard with grannies. I have a friend and the child came down and the mother said, come sit on my knee. And the granny said, no, I'll take him. And the child ended up with granny. Because it's hard, if your daughter's at home, you're still a mother to her. So you mother her kids, but that's not always right. They should show that more. So across the focus groups so far, there has been this theme of power struggles between mothers and daughters, which are inevitable, particularly when they're co-resident in the one house, but can even occur when they're simply living nearby. And these power struggles as being a key family issue that actually genuinely do require attention and support. And a programme featuring this power struggle would be useful. But they identified that although they know these power struggles are important, that it's the job of granny to never discipline, but it's very hard for granny to learn to never discipline if she's used to being the disciplinary head of household up till then. So the audience are very aware that these issues exist and are very critical of the programmes. They're saying all the time they should do a programme on that theme. They're constantly kind of saying this. Another one here, this is more of a discussion. There's 3 people talking here. And again, it's interesting because they're just kind of saying, well, I don't watch them now, meaning the television programmes, but I see them sometimes and I've never seen a grandparent. I saw one and the one's mother was there, so the mother's mother was there. She lived on her own with the children. She was helping out in every way that she could. She was very good with her. And you've the automatic interruption. They generally are, Mary. Grannies are generally good. She would give in to the child. She had to stop doing that, you see. The grandparents will give in to interruption. The granny so that's interesting. Somebody's questioning the gender of grandparent within the focus group. The granny will give in to the child. They will try the granny, because if they don't get something off you, they will get soft with the granny. That's part of being a granny. So this is coming back to the same theme again. The job of granny is the unconditional love without discipline. The job of granny is to be soft and to give the treats. But this is interesting because on the one hand, you've got this, you've got the hegemonic reading coming out at the same time as you've got the counter-hegemonic reading coming out, and the audience being unaware that they're contradicting themselves. Because on the one hand, they're saying in that family, that granny had to stop being soft. And of course the psychologist was right, and of course we're going to accept in every way that what he said was right, and that granny had to stop being soft. But every other granny in the world has to be soft because that's the job of a granny. And they're not seeing, so it's not as simple as saying they're giving a mediated reading. They're actually at one and the same time giving both a hegemonic and a completely counter-hegemonic reading without seeing the contradiction within that, which is what's interesting about it. The other kin, the presentation of Thomas. Okay, yeah, sorry. So they had a lot of sympathy, but it was all emotion that came out when they talked about Thomas. There wasn't a lot of discussion that wasn't purely emotive. They felt sorry for him. They felt sad for him. They felt nostalgic because of what happened with the Thomas situation, but they didn't have a lot to say about it other than expressing their strong emotions on the matter. So what we can see from all of this is that kin are minimised within these programmes. Their role is presented as unimportant and or threatening. It's not unique to TV, but TV intensifies the issue. Now, why does TV intensify the issue? If you're writing a parenting manual, it's easy to simply ignore the grandmother, or to put in one little small quote saying ignore the grandmother. If you're going into a real person's real house and putting a fly on the wall and there's a granny resident in that house or there's an uncle resident in that house, it can be much harder to edit out every single clip which shows them. So they become featured. They are there as the disruptor. You want to present a nuclear family only, but this family isn't a nuclear family only. There is a kin member living in the same household. So how are we going to deal with that? So reality TV makes this discourse more unavoidable because they simply do exist and the camera can't help but pick them up. Most kinship ties are being symbolically eradicated. They're most tolerated where the mother parents alone, where providing the kin support is female, which is interesting. Providing the kin support is female, she's allowed to fill the father void. And there's strong audience interpretation, strong audience acceptance of these issues, but it is mediated with a sense of loss, it's mediated with a sense of sadness, which comes through frustration and even humour. Sometimes they are just laughing at the psychologists, they're laughing at Supernanny, they're laughing at the people presenting these programmes. But there's also a sense of loss, a sense of sadness. Why do they just not understand that these roles are important and these roles need to continue? So to go back to the title, what I'm saying is that the nuclear family is presented within sociology, which is what I was saying in the beginning, as a self-fulfilling prophecy because we focus on it so exclusively and so intensively. We make it as important as it is. Within these television programmes, the same process is happening. And within audiences, they are continuing to internalise these messages to some extent, with not completely, but to some extent, that the role of kin is less important than they previously thought.
Okay, thanks,
Okay.
Ciara. That's great.